Mesdames et messieurs, chers collègues, nous venons d'entendre l'Aïda, acte 2, la marche des trompettes de Giuseppe Verdi, interprétée par Madame Luce Perret du Conservatoire national de musique et de danse de Lyon, qui nous fait toujours l'honneur de nous accompagner dans nos moments un peu solennels. So, dear friends, dear Professor Stiglitz, I'm afraid the rest of it will have to be in French. But I just wanted to welcome you and say, at least now in English, how much honor you're bringing to us. L'École normale supérieure de Lyon a aujourd'hui l'honneur de remettre les insignes de docteur honoris causa à M. Joseph Stiglitz, économiste américain, professeur à l'Université de Columbia et lauréat 2001 du prix de la Banque de Suède en sciences économiques en mémoire d'Alfred Nobel. Enfin, pour nous, c'est le prix Nobel de l'économie. Comme le connaît l'ensemble du monde. Ce prix a été remis conjointement à Joseph Stiglitz, George Akerlof et Michael Spence pour récompenser leurs travaux fondateurs sur la prise en compte de l'effet d'asymétrie d'information sur l'ensemble des marchés, une démarche qui a révolutionné l'analyse microéconomique et, on me dit, plus largement l'ensemble de l'économie. La présente cérémonie intervient aujourd'hui dans le cadre des Journées de l'économie. Cette année, ces journées de l'économie sont intitulées « Environnement, numérique, société ». 3 petits points, la décennie de tous les dangers, probablement vrai. Et Joseph Stiglitz nous fait l'honneur d'être le grand témoin de cette 12e édition qui rapproche, comme vous le savez, l'économie et les citoyens. De nombreux événements participent de cette journée de l'économie. Il y aura à l'ENS de Lyon des conférences sur médias et démocratie, les nouveaux fronts de la recherche en économie, à la rencontre des grands économistes de demain. Et c'est l'occasion pour moi de souligner le travail fait par Laurent Simula et les gens du laboratoire GATT pour rapprocher les jeunes économistes de la population et des étudiants. Une addition bienvenue à ces manifestations. Voilà, dans une période où les incertitudes sur notre futur se multiplient, qu'on songe à la question environnementale ou à la montée des populismes, il est important de partager les analyses, celles des chercheurs, des praticiens et des décideurs. Les sources de tension se précisent et il convient de mettre au point les stratégies pour les aborder. Dans ce contexte et à l'issue de la cérémonie, le professeur Stiglitz donnera une conférence qui arrive à point nommé. Il s'agira, en proposant d'aller au-delà du néolibéralisme, d'explorer quelques paradigmes alternatifs qu'il conviendrait d'adopter. L'idée que les marchés ne sont pas sans défaillance constitue l'une des lignes directrices de la recherche du professeur Stiglitz et de son engagement dans les institutions nationales, internationales et dans le débat public depuis de nombreuses années. Les chercheurs en économie de l'ENS de Lyon portent une attention particulière aux politiques publiques et aux liens entre économie et démocratie. Leurs recherches ont été influencées assez tôt par les travaux du professeur Stiglitz et c'est un lien fort au travers des enseignements de l'ENS de Lyon en master comme en thèse qui se poursuit entre ces travaux fondateurs et ceux qui sont conduits aujourd'hui dans notre établissement, puisque nos étudiants s'intéressent souvent et particulièrement à l'analyse des politiques publiques dans les pays développés et en développement et s'interrogent sur la manière de les réformer dans le contexte actuel. La cérémonie qui nous occupe là va nous permettre de remettre le plus haut diplôme français à un chercheur dont les travaux sont amplement reconnus par la communauté nationale et la communauté internationale. L'École normale supérieure de Lyon, faut-il le dire, est particulièrement honorée que vous ayez accepté, cher professeur, cette distinction. Nous vous en remercions très chaleureusement. Je vais maintenant donner la parole à Laurent Simula qui prononcera quelques mots d'éloge avant de pouvoir poursuivre. Laurent.
Thank you, Jean-François. Dear Professor Stiglitz, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered today to award an honorary doctorate to Professor Stiglitz. It is a big honor for INS de Lyon. We are celebrating Professor Stiglitz's tremendous contribution to economic research, to the diffusion of economic knowledge beyond the community of experts, and to the understanding of public policies and political institutions. Many of you in the attendance are not experts in economics. If many of you have read the important books by Professor Stiglitz, you might be less familiar with the research by Professor Stiglitz in a more academic perspective. I therefore decided to focus on the latter. It is not an easy job to summarize more than 400 scientific articles in about 5 minutes, so I will try to provide you with the main insights. Professor Stiglitz's research and engagement were inspired by the discrepancies between the world he observed and the economic models that were supposed to reflect it. Up to the 70s, the economic paradigm was dominated by the idea that a world with not too many imperfect information would be close to a world with perfect information. However, unemployment, poverty, and economic crisis had been affecting masses of people in developed countries. And market inefficiencies were even stronger when looking at developing economies with imperfect information, missing markets, massive unemployment, and pervasive institutions. Adam Smith's famous invisible hand, according to which everyone pursuing its own interest leads to an equilibrium of all markets, is invisible just because it is simply not here. And one of the key reasons highlighted by Professor Stiglitz is asymmetric information. Asymmetric information is a situation in which some parties are better informed than others. On the labor market, an employer may be unable to observe the skills and motivation of a potential employee. On markets for commodities, the seller might be better informed about the quality than potential buyers. On capital markets, insurance companies might be unable to observe to which class of risk an individual belongs. Accounting for asymmetric information led to a complete revolution in the way to think about economics and allowed to answer questions not previously addressed in the old perfect information paradigm. It also revealed that even a small amount of imperfect information could have profound effects on the nature of the equilibrium. All these examples of asymmetric information give rise to market failures that I will illustrate on the labor market. If an employee was shirking in a situation without unemployment, he would easily find another position. With Carl Shapiro, Professor Stiglitz showed that there had to be unemployment in the equilibrium as a discipline device to force workers to work. Wages above the market clearing wage are therefore a way for firms to make sure that workers work effectively. And because such wages do not clear the market, there will be persistent and involuntary unemployment in the equilibrium. The problems of information asymmetries are even deeper. Even if an individual has no more information about his ability than potential employers, the moment he goes to work, an asymmetry is created. Indeed, the employer knows more about the individual's ability than others within the economy. And consequently, the market for youth labor doesn't work properly, which plays against labor mobility and gives market power to the current employer. And in return, the market for new labor is affected because an individual is locked into a job who will be more risk-averse when accepting a new position. And firms can also be tempted to create imperfect information as a way to increase their own market power in the market. Imperfect information is not just the result of market failures. They may also be created by the market itself. Because of market imperfection, well-designed public policies are especially important. And here appears the connection between economics and politics, which is especially important today in a time of major changes from migration, increasing inequalities, to climate change. In his last book, People, Power, and Profits, Professor Stiglitz shows that, I quote, "The view that government is a problem, not the solution, is simply wrong. To the contrary, many, if not most, of our society's problems, from the excesses of pollution, financial instability, and economic inequality, have been created by the market." It will be the subject of Professor Stiglitz's keynote lecture today, and I very much look forward to it. Once again, I would like to thank Professor Stiglitz for his seminal and inspiring contribution and engagement. We are honored to celebrate him today.
Professeur Stiglitz, par décision du Conseil d'administration, approuvée par le ministère de l'Europe et des Affaires étrangères, il vous est décerné le titre de docteur honoris causa de l'École normale supérieure de Lyon. J'ai l'honneur de vous en remettre les insignes et le diplôme. Je vous remets aussi la médaille de l'École normale supérieure de Lyon. Merci.
Well, let me thank you very much for this honor that you've bestowed on me. I think it's particularly significant in these troubled times that we're facing, that we recognize that there's a global community of scholars where ideas can go across boundaries freely. It is the most important, and I say the most positive aspect of globalization. And let me thank you for that wonderful summary of my research. You may have embellished it a little bit, but it was a wonderful summary. This community of scholars is particularly important today when in many countries, including my own, there is a concerted attack against all the truth institutions, against education, against the media, against the judiciary, against the professional bureaucracy. And I think it's very important for there to be solidarity of all those who are committed to scholarship and knowledge, And I accept that in that spirit. Thank you very much.
Avant de conclure, nous allons écouter la gigue de la suite pour violoncelle, une étude de Bach adaptée pour trompette par Michael Gisondi, qui s'est encore interprétée par Madame Luce Perret du Conservatoire national supérieur de musique et de danse.
Okay, so we'll continue with the keynote lecture by Professor Stiglitz. Yes, we are waiting for some students to enter the room, so we'll start in a few seconds. Okay, so we will continue with the keynote lecture by Professor Stiglitz. It will be about, after neoliberalism, the need for a new paradigm. And I would like to remind you that you have the possibility to ask questions during the lecture, and it will be shown on the screen. You can ask your questions by SMS, and I will receive the questions on an iPad, and then I will ask the question for yourself to Professor Stiglitz. So I think we should are very honored to listen to the lecture by Professor Stiglitz, and we should thank him for his presence today.
Well, it's a real opportunity to be able to talk with you about some of the ideas that I think give some insights into the political problems that we're facing and economic problems we're facing today. The perspective that I'm going to try to articulate is that a lot of our problems have to do with a particular view of economics, sometimes called neoliberalism. I sometimes refer to it as market fundamentalism. It was the idea that markets on their own could solve all of society's problems. And what I want to do is try to explain very briefly the evolution of these ideas, the ways in which these ideas were actually contrary to what economic theory was saying at the very time they became fashionable. And then I want to spend about the last part of my lecture talking about an alternative paradigm, more in the area of policy, but giving a framework for thinking about how do we go forward. As I said, neoliberalism is the notion that markets on their own are basically efficient and fair and should be relied upon for the allocation of scarce economic resources. And as you mentioned in your introduction, this perspective, which Ronald Reagan put it, government is the problem, not the solution. There's a long history of these kinds of ideas that were motivated more by politics than by a real understanding of economics. The central idea of this politics was to denigrate the role of the state. An example, a very dramatic example, was of a failure of markets was the Great Depression, when 25% of all workers were unemployed. You would have said that the Great Depression was proof that markets sometimes don't work perfectly. And yet, surprisingly, a large fraction of, say, the American economics profession in the 1930s response to this really social and economic calamity was to say, don't intervene in the market. Let the market take care of itself. Schumpeter talked about it as creative destruction, that it would clean out the system of all the rot, and that it would, out of the ashes would come, like a phoenix, a new economic system, a new an economy. So the view was, and it was supported by most American economists, was that you should do nothing. Keynes, one of the great economists of the early part of the mid part of the 20th century, said no, that the markets sometimes fail, and that there were actions that the government could take to increase GDP, increase output, and reduce unemployment. And what was so surprising is, even after he explained this, I thought very coherently, very cogently, opposition to these ideas were very strong, particularly in conservative circles. And why? They didn't want to admit that there was a possibility of a market failure, and they were especially didn't want to admit of a market failure that could be corrected by the government, because that would lead to a larger state. And their political position was, let's weaken the state. After President Roosevelt in the United States and other governments succeeded in intervening in the economy and restoring the economy to full employment, the idea of market fundamentalism weakened. And there was a consensus, a global consensus, for several decades around the need for selective government intervention, the need for the role for government, and it became one of the major thrusts of economic research was to try to define more precisely the role of government and the role of the market. But then politics again took over. And in the late 1970s, beginning of the 1980s, the idea of market fundamentalism, of neoliberalism, was revived by Ronald Reagan in the United States, Margaret Thatcher in the UK. In the United States, it got a new name, but that didn't change the nature. It was called supply-side economics. The reason they called it supply-side was that Keynes had emphasized that unemployment was a result of lack of aggregate demand. And they wanted to distinguish themselves from the Keynesians. And so if one was about demand, they were going to be about supply. they minimized or they ignored the role of market failures. Market failures are things like externalities like pollution, climate change, the lack of competition, imperfect information. They wanted to give free rein to corporations. They said that the only thing that corporations should do was to maximize the value of the shareholders. In fact, Milton Friedman, who was the high priest of the Chicago School, which was the place where these ideas reigned, said it was basically a sin for a corporation to think about anything other than shareholders. If they engaged in corporate responsibility, that was irresponsible in his point of view. And he succeeded in the United States of having laws passed that say that corporations have to only focus on shareholders. And if they did anything else, they could be brought to court and sued for dereliction of duty. They also had no concern about distribution or inequality. In fact, when the data about inequality began to come in, and the inequality in the United States started to rise in the late 70s, early 80s, President Reagan's response was, let's stop collecting the data. If we don't have the data, nobody will know that inequality was increasing, as long as we don't look with our eyes and see what's going on in the country. Well, he argued this school argued that not only were there not market failures, the view was, a very political view, that governments always failed. And so even if there were a market failure, government would not be able to solve the problem. There was no economic analysis here, even though it became very central to the perspective of many economists. It was really, I would say, a religious belief. It wasn't based on either economic or political science. Yes, some governments fail. In the United States, anybody who lived through George Bush or Donald Trump knows that sometimes governments don't work very well. So we all know that the governments are not perfect, but at the same time, we have to recognize that no country has been successful without a large role of government. And even an imperfect government, and all governments are imperfect, can make a difference. This perspective also ignored the potential of strengthening public institutions and actually took actions to weaken them, as we see is going on in the United States today. And they ignored the potential for other forms of collective action and made these more difficult. And I want to emphasize this because we think of government when we think of people acting together, but there are many other, the government goes on at many levels, local levels, regional levels, national levels, global level, but there's also other forms of collective action where people are working together to solve societal problems. And I'll talk about a few of these later, but a couple of examples are collective bargaining by unions on the part of workers, or class action suits by individuals to redress harm that is imposed on them by corporations. Well, there was actually a historical curiosity about the particular time in which this renewed neoliberalism, market fundamentalism arose under Reagan and Thatcher in the late 70s, early 80s, because this was exactly the time, or a little later than the time, in which economic theory had explained that markets don't work. There was a reference to one of the things that I've often said. One of the ideas that had a real power in economics was the idea that individuals and firms in the pursuit of their self-interest would lead, as if by an invisible hand, to the well-being of society. And this was what Adam Smith argued. It was and people who believe in market fundamentalism took that seriously. One of the important theorems that Bruce Greenwald, my colleague at Columbia, and I proved was, as you put it, the reason that the invisible hand often seems invisible is that it's not there. And the point is that what we were able to show is that the market is almost never efficient, and that there are many, many examples of the inefficiencies that are pervasive in the economy, and the real challenge of the government is to select the biggest ones where to intervene. But the presumption, what we did is with Adam Smith, the presumption was that markets were efficient, and then you identify particular examples where that was not true. And what we showed is the presumption was that markets were inefficient, and you had to identify the big areas where you had to intervene. The analysis that markets don't work, typically in producing either efficient or fair outcomes, was a large body of work that began with Ken Arrow and Gerard Debreu in the 1950s, both of whom got the Nobel Prize for their work. But it continued with research showing the ability of firms to maintain market power. Game theory was an important development in this area. An understanding more about inequality and the way that it harms an economy. And there was a wide body of research showing that government intervention could make things much better. Well, the next big historical event was the collapse of communism in the late 1980s. And this gave renewed vigor to the idea of neoliberalism for the wrong reason. It was often thought, or generally thought, that this proved that markets worked. But the failure, the victory, you might say, of the market economy over communism was not due to the wonders of the market economy. It was that communism was a flawed, failed economic system. So Reagan could take pride that his ideas had triumphed. It wasn't the case that his ideas triumphed. It was that communism was basically a rotten system, corrupt system, and it couldn't work. But there developed an idea that was popularized by Francis Fukuyama, a political scientist, who wrote an influential book called The End of History. So, economists should never make forecasts, but political scientists should even be more careful about making forecasts. But his forecast was that this marked the end of history, that going forward, all countries would converge to market economies and liberal democracies. Now, in light of what's happened in the last 5 years, last 2 years, with Philippines, Brazil, Russia, the United States, India, it seems a little bit naive to say that everybody's converging to democracy, or that even we're going to our free market economy, especially with the rise of protectionism by Trump. So that raises three key questions that I want to spend a few minutes talking about. How do we explain what has happened in the last few years, the rise of these demagogues, the anti-market economy sentiment? What are the dangers, and is another alternative world possible? And what is the appropriate policy response to the moment? So, in my diagnosis of what has gone wrong. Central is the idea that neoliberalism has failed. The policies based on this market fundamentalism entail things like lowering the tax rates at the top, deregulating the economy. The idea was very simple, that deregulation was taking away the restraints, lowering the tax rates would incentivize, and the two together would result in faster economic growth from which everybody would benefit. And they argued that even tax revenues would go up, even though tax rates had gone down. Every one of their predictions was wrong, except for one. They had anticipated that it would lead to more inequality, but they got even more inequality than they had hoped for. The growth slowed, inequality grew, those at the bottom and middle saw their incomes stagnate or even fall, deficits soared, and eventually the economy went into crisis, the crisis of 2008. When things didn't work out well, they doubled down on the strategy. I don't know if this is a French expression. Double down is if you gamble and you're losing, rather than saying, you know, the gambling is really stupid. What you say is, I'll double my bet and hope to get out of your losing streak. It doesn't work, and it didn't work in economic policy, but that's what happened in the United States and many other countries as the neoliberal ideas didn't work. Rather than saying, look, at cutting tax rates doesn't stimulate the economy, what did they do? They said, let's cut them some more. We haven't done enough. And when austerity didn't work, they said, let's be a little bit more austerity. And it was sort of like, I sometimes give an analogy, it was like the medieval bloodletters. When they used to let the blood, the idea was that bloodletting would get the bad humors out of the body and that person would recover. When it didn't work, what did they do? They took out more blood. Do you think they eventually recovered as they took out all the blood of the person? He normally died. And that's what Europe did to Greece and a number of other countries. So rather than learning the lesson from the observation that the neoliberal policies weren't working, they doubled down and things worked out even worse. So from my perspective, I think this, quote, neoliberal experiment can be declared a failure. And we need to move on to an alternative, and as I say, at the end, I'll try to describe what that alternative is. Let me just give a few graphs that illustrate how bad things have been. This shows growth in the decades after World War II, and then the decades after neoliberalism went into place. And what you see is both in Europe and the United States, the growth rates slowed down as a result of neoliberalism. I said that even though growth was slower, most of the benefits went to those at the very top. And the next two graphs illustrate this. America does everything bigger and better than other countries. And one of the things that we really do well is inequality. And this graph illustrates the nature of that. Those of you with good eyes can see a dark line at the bottom. That's not the horizontal axis. That's the average income of the bottom 90% of Americans. And if you have very good eyes, you can see that the average income of the bottom 90% of Americans has hardly changed at all since 1973. That's more than 45 years. But you don't have to have good eyes to see that dotted line at the top. The dotted line at the top is the average income of the top 1%. And you should be able to tell from that graph that they've done very well over the last 45 years. So, and I should say, you know, one of the things, if you've taken a statistics course, you know how to manipulate statistics to distort views, but these are just the numbers that come out of the surveys and out of the databases. So I haven't even manipulated the data to make it look worse. These are, we call it natural numbers. I haven't taken a log or a log or anything like that. These are the numbers. Europe looks a little bit better, but not a lot better, and has exactly the same pattern. So these are the same numbers for the bottom 90% for UK and Spain, and you see that they all look, if you have a microscope, they look a little bit better, and the top 1% doesn't look quite as aggressive, but the overall pattern is similar. What I want to emphasize is there never was a theory behind neoliberalism. It was not based on economic science. It was, as I said before, basically based on politics. As I said before, research had explained why market failures and exploitation were pervasive. Even limited government action could improve matters. Shareholder value maximization did not lead to societal well-being. One of the reasons I was so annoyed with Milton Friedman and his success in getting the laws changed was that Sandy Grossman and I had written a paper in 1977 and wrote another one a couple years later than that, explaining that shareholder value maximization would not be welfare maximizing. Milton Friedman never tried to refute our paper. He couldn't, because it was right. But he was successful in the politics, and we were not. Until, and this is maybe an important lesson for some of the students here, you have to fight battles over the long term, not just over the short term. And so one of the things that's just happened in the last couple of months is that the American CEOs of the largest companies, have agreed that shareholder value maximization is wrong. And they said that we need to take into account the consequences to our workers, our customers, our communities. And so, you know, a hard slog, but I think we finally succeeded in changing the national discourse to make it understand that shareholder value maximization is not the right framework for corporate governance. Another aspect of the theory that was prevalent in the neoliberalism was that globalization, taking down tariff barriers, would lead everybody to be better off. Economic theory had explained the country as a whole might be better off, but even then, I had written a paper showing that if there are imperfect risk markets, and there are always imperfect risk markets, everybody in all countries could be worse off because of the increase in risk. But even if the country as a whole was better off, there was a wide body of research that argued that unskilled workers in advanced countries would be worse off, particularly when there was trade with developing countries where wages were low. And that's exactly what happened. So the idea that free trade would necessarily make everybody better off without government doing something was just wrong. But it was a very strong part of the politics of the era. So I think the way you have to understand neoliberalism was not a set of economic doctrines. It was really a set of political doctrines. It was based on ideology and special interest taking advantage of ideology. There were the rich who didn't want to pay their fair share of taxes, so that in the United States today, for instance, just a couple weeks ago, a report came out that the richest Americans pay lower tax rates than the bottom 50%. And so the bottom 50% on average includes people who have very low incomes. There were companies that wanted to be able to exploit others. Our cigarette companies that wanted to produce addictive products that would kill people and pretend that they didn't. Our pharmaceutical companies that produced opioid and pushed them and leading to an opioid crisis, resulting in contributing to the fact that the life expectancy in the United States is now in decline since Trump became president. Remarkable for a rich country. There were the food companies who have led to contributed to an epidemic of childhood diabetes. The auto companies who lied about their devised ways of deceiving tests on their fuel emissions. So the companies wanted to exploit others, and they didn't want to be regulated. And the coal and oil companies that wanted to pollute the world. So, given all this, it's not a surprise that there's anger at the elites who had promised that neoliberalism and globalization would bring benefits to all. And that leads to the question, were they lying, were they honest, but simply misinformed? In the US, and I think in many other countries in the vax world that were afflicted by the crisis, there was a real, the view that there was that it was elites that were shaping the system to advantage themselves was reinforced, or it was brought home by the response to the crisis. For instance, Obama appointed the same individuals who had been responsible for financial market deregulation that had brought the economy into the crisis. He appointed them to fix it. And guess, when they fixed it, where all the money went? We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. And the mindset, maybe I can give you a flavor of the mindset. I was right after Lehman Brothers collapsed. It was September of 2008, and Obama was running for the presidency, and there was a sense that this was a moment of national unity, and the Republicans and Democrats had to agree on what to do. And so Obama had a conference call of trying to ask economic advisors, what should he do? And most of the people on the conference call were bankers. And their first question was, the proposal was a $700 billion bailout for the banks. And their question was, why only $700 billion? And the answer was, don't worry, if you need more money, we have it. We just thought $1 trillion seemed too big. So it gave, and when I raised the question, what about the workers? What about the people who were losing their homes? The bankers' response was, let's be serious. We're not talking about these uninteresting things. And they went ahead focusing on the banks. So given that, it's not a surprise that there is a belief that the political and economic system seemed rigged. In Europe, there's a different, but in many ways, similar set of problems. The Growth and Stability Pact was supposed to assure growth and stability and convergence, that the richest and the poorest countries would grow together. But it didn't do any of those, and predictably so. It was based on, again, neoliberalism. Growth slowed, the euro crisis was severe, and the rich countries got richer, and the poor poorer. There was not convergence, there was divergence. And austerity was supposed to restore growth. Greece gave the most dramatic example where it led to a 25% fall in real incomes and 25% unemployment. In many ways, globalization was not only, and neoliberalism was not only bad for the economy, but also for our democracies. The reason for this was that certain key areas of concern, those affecting economic well-being, seemed to be taken out of the hands of citizens. These included environmental, health, safety, and even economic regulations. For instance, countries could be sued if they violated the rights of corporations, even when the corporation's activities threatened the public interest under some provisions called investment agreements and ISDS. These are technical, but the idea that you could be sued for passing a regulation to advance the public interest. I mean, let me give you an example. It could be an environmental regulation about climate change, a regulation you can't have a toxic dump in the middle of a city. One of the most famous was a suit by Philip Morris against Uruguay when Uruguay passed a very simple regulation saying that you had to disclose that cigarettes were bad for your health. And that disclosure was intended to discourage people from smoking. It did that. Philip Morris's profits went down, and they sued under the investment agreement and said, you've hurt our basic right to kill people. And the suit is so expensive. The arbitrators get paid huge amounts, the lawyers get paid a huge amount, that Uruguay couldn't afford it. So in this particular case, fortunately, some rich Americans like Mayor Bloomberg stepped up and said, we'll pay the legal cost for Uruguay. And eventually, Uruguay won. But these problems of undermining democracy are even more severe in developing countries and emerging markets, where capital market liberalization, which is the idea that money can go in and out of a country freely, allowed Wall Street to pull its money out of a country whenever there was a candidate that they didn't like. And this actually happened in Brazil. And so it seemed to many countries as if Wall Street had more voting power than the citizens of the country. So taking all this into account, it's understandable that there has been a backlash against globalization, against neoliberalism, but it is still the case that a particular form of the backlash, represented by Trump and by other demagogues, represents a real threat to our civilization and to our standards of living. So I want to spend a few minutes trying to describe what I think of as the real source of the wealth of nations, why we are so much better off today than we were 250 years ago, and we should really appreciate what's happened in the last 250 years. And by explaining that, I hope to convince you that there is a real threat to our civilization. So the next graph shows, the measures of living standards, like GDP per capita. I don't want to put too much weight on the data, but I'll give you another set of data that gives the same picture for a number of countries. And what you see, what you see in this graph very clearly is that almost no changes in standards of living for hundreds and hundreds of years until the late 18th century. And then it suddenly went up very quickly in Western Europe and then and the United States, and then eventually it was followed by East Asia. This is another set of data where in the UK they love to collect data, and they have a lot of data on both wages and the cost of living. And you can see, again, the same pattern, almost no changes for hundreds of years until, actually, in this data, it's the mid-19th century. If you look at the data closely, those of you who are trained in economics, you can see that if you have a plague where 30% of the labor force gets destroyed, wages will go up, but not a lot. And then they started to go down again. And this is a graph showing what's happened even since 1820 on life expectancy. Life expectancy in most countries have doubled. We're all complaining as we get older about our health, but when we realize that we probably would have been dead by now, we appreciate really the dramatic change that has happened. So that leads us to the next question: what made all this possible? And I argue that there are three things. Science, advances in our understanding of the world around it, is probably the most important, but also social science, advances in our understanding of humankind. And finally, advances in social organization. We've moved beyond a simple agricultural economy where people don't have very complex interactions. You run your farm and then you have simple markets. A modern innovation economy is very complex. And we have to be able to cooperate, to coordinate, and that's where you need things like coordination of economic activities through markets governed by the rule of law, collective action, and politics, which set the rules of the game with separation of powers, checks and balances, and all the apparatus that we think of as a well-functioning democracy. And all of these were central ideas of the Enlightenment. And it was this, you might say, the Enlightenment that set the stage for the progress that has occurred. In all of this, there are one set of institutions that I referred to a little bit earlier in my remarks, which is the critical role of truth institutions. All the systems described above require ways of assessing the truth, collecting information, weighing the information, verifying the information, transmitting the information. And the problem is that all are now under attack. The media, the judiciary, the universities, our research institutions, our independent bureaucracy. It's not gotten as bad in Europe, but too often you follow the American model. In America, one of the parties is very hostile to science. It's particularly hostile to climate science, but it is hostile to all science. President Trump proposed a 30% cut in all research budgets. The general view about our universities is that they corrode our society because they teach students about liberal values, about tolerance, about the Enlightenment, about science. And all of these undermine their particular perspective on the world. So there is a concerted attack against our university. So putting it maybe a little bit more broadly, the most disturbing aspect of our political moment is the attack on our basic epistemological system, with far-reaching effects on our civilization, our standard of living, and the functioning of our systems of political and social organization. So what I want to do in the final few minutes here is to talk about an alternative. I was writing my book, People, Power, and Profits, for an American, partly for an American audience, but I thought it was relevant for others. So I used the term to describe this alternative system, progressive capitalism, but could just as well have been described as a reinvigorated social democracy. Central to this idea is a new social contract between the market, the state, and civil society. And I used the term progressive capitalism to remind us that the market is going to play a central role. I've described before a lot of criticisms about modern corporations, American corporations, and how corrosive of our society they are. But that's because they have the wrong incentives and the wrong regulations. You cannot have a complex, decentralized society without some degree of decentralization. You need to have markets. So one of my main themes is that we're going to have a role for markets, but they have to be circumscribed. They have to be regulated. I use the term progressive to remind us that it is not unfettered capitalism, not the kind of Reaganomics. Capitalism is not an end in itself, but a means to broader societal objectives. And when I talk about social democracy, democracy is supposed to remind us of the importance of democratic values, and social is to remind us that we are trying to create a better society. When I talk about this new social contract between the market, the state, and civil society, I want to emphasize that you have to, one should recognize that a successful society must be based on a rich ecology of institutional arrangements. We sometimes oversimplify it and talk about the market or the state, as if those are the only two actors in our society. But actually, all of our societies have many, many other kinds of institutions. Maybe I'm a little bit biased in my view, but I think America's most successful institutions are our educational institutions, our great universities like Columbia and Harvard and Princeton, and University of California. All of these institutions are either foundations, not-for-profits, or state. Most of them are actually not-for-profit foundations. Berkeley is one of the very successful state institutions. None of them are for-profit. The emblematic of the for-profit institutions is Trump University. And that excelled in only one thing: exploiting vulnerable students, charging them large tuition without delivering anything to them. And many of you may have known he was sued over and over again, just like he sued everybody. What he did to those students was so outrageous that he was sued, and before he became president, he had to settle those suits for millions and millions and millions of dollars. But there are other important forms of institutions, cooperatives. The only good-behaving financial institutions, banks in the United States, were our cooperatives. We called them credit unions. They were the only ones who did not engage in predatory behavior, did not engage in excessively risk behavior, and they're the only ones after the crisis that continued to lend and expanded their lending to small and medium-sized enterprises. So what I want to emphasize, we sometimes forget the importance of all these other institutions, which are important, can be an important part of our economic system. And the final thing what I want to emphasize, that I'm not going to say much about, but I think it is fundamental, that economic relations shape who we are. Cooperatives, for instance, encourage cooperative behavior and have broad implications for the nature of our society. Bankers behave differently from other people, and there's been a lot of experiments in behavioral economics to show that they are more selfish and more dishonest than other people. And when you remind bankers that they're bankers, they become even more selfish and more dishonest. So the point is that the economic context in which you work affects how you think, who you are. And it's something that we often don't talk about in economics, although there's a wide body of research in behavioral economics that now recognizes this. So the ideas of progressivism, the ideas of progressive capitalism, are based on a long intellectual tradition. It goes back to the Enlightenment, as I said before. The Enlightenment, one of the basic insights was that progress is possible, and it is within our power to construct an economic and social system that advances progress. And obviously, as an economist, I talk a lot about standards of living, ability to have sustainable increases in life expectancies, and progress in living within our planetary boundaries. But there are many other dimensions to what we should mean by progress. One of them is notions of social justice, a more humane society with less prejudice, less discrimination, less exploitation, more tolerance. In American history, when we talk about these things, we think back to the late 19th century. This was a period that was called the Gilded Age. Some of you know the robber barons who were really successful in exploitation and ring-seeking, led to a level of inequality that is comparable to what we have today. And the response to these inequalities, not only in economics, but even more important, in political power, led to a whole set of reforms that we call the progressive reforms. And those include competition laws, social legislation, a whole set of changes in our economic and social system. And the point is that we succeeded in creating, through these reforms, a more dynamic capitalism and a prosperity that was better shared, and in which power was not concentrated in the hands of relatively few. In a way, you can say that we help create what is now sometimes called a middle-class society in which everybody shared. But over the last 40 years, under the neoliberalism, we have been rapidly deconstructing that kind of society, getting to the kind of society that I pictured where the top 1% is doing very well and the rest of our society has been stagnating. And I want to remind you that 40 years is a long time in the history of capitalism. You know, if you think about it, we basically had 200 years of modern capitalism. And 40 years is 20% of that 200 years. So we're not talking about a moment in time. It is a large chunk of time from which we ought to feel confident in making inferences. So I want to talk about now what are the major elements of progressive capitalism or this rejuvenated social democracy. There are four, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I want to have time for questions. The first is rewriting the rules of the economy, rewriting them in ways to constrain power and its abuses, to create a more efficient and fair economy, to ensure that we live within our planetary boundaries, to give more scope for collective action. And the second is public expenditures, to do what the private sector cannot or will not do, or to do what the government has a comparative advantage of doing. And the third is fair and efficient taxation to help finance these public expenditures. And the fourth is a whole set of reforms to ensure a decent life for most citizens. So let me go through those fairly quickly. The first point is that markets don't exist in a vacuum. They have to be structured. So what do we mean by structured? They have to be, you can't play any game, you know, whether it's football or, you know, rugby, whatever game, you have to have rules and you have to have referees, you have to have structure. And societies can't function without good rules. It's part of what we mean by the rule of law. There's been, in the United States and many other countries, a strong anti-regulation sentiment. People say regulations are stifling. My response to that is there are some regulations that are bad, and we have to constantly pass them, reassess them. But society can't live without regulations. The Ten Commandments were a simple set of regulations. But if we want to think it in more modern terms, without stoplights, which is a simple regulation. A stoplight is a regulation that says who can go first and then who goes next. You know, you have a simple set of regulations. Without stoplights in New York City, we would be in constant gridlock. You couldn't go anywhere, and we would be totally dysfunctional. So that's an example of a regulation that's absolutely necessary. Without regulations on the environment, we would be, our cities like Los Angeles and New York City would be like Beijing and New Delhi, where you can't breathe, and your life expectancy is significantly shortened. So you need these regulations, but of course the rules have consequences for the distribution of income, and you have to think about those distributive consequences. The problem is that the rules that dominate the structure of our economy today were written in an era of neoliberalism. I gave one example, like that firms should just maximize shareholder value. It wasn't always that way, but that's what Milton Friedman succeeded in getting them to do. And those rules, those neoliberal rules, resulted in an economy with more inequality, more market power, and actually a less efficient economy, a slower growing economy. And obviously that particular perspective ignored the market failures, ignored the need for collective action. It was a very narrow view of the market economy. So the basic point is that we now have to rewrite those rules again, and that has to be done for virtually every aspect of our economy. To ensure more competition, better corporate governance, bankruptcy laws, better managed financial sector, better managed globalization, better macroeconomic management, including monetary policy, not just focusing on inflation, for instance, but also taking into account unemployment. We have to have rules to reduce the scope for exploitation, to facilitate collective action, to, most importantly, I'll come to that in a second, to ensure that we live within our planetary boundaries, as I said. In Europe, the rules of the Eurozone need to be rewritten, especially the Growth and Stability Pact. There's a need for a banking union, a common deposit insurance, a need for economic support for unemployment, a solidarity fund for stabilization. There are lots of others. I want to dwell just for a minute on one set of policies that has gotten a lot of attention for dealing with the problem of climate change, and that's a Green New Deal. The central idea here was to think about the possibility of using of this existential threat, climate change, to our economy, to our society, as an opportunity really to help restructure the economy. We need prices to guide the economy, but prices alone won't suffice. They have to be complemented by regulations and public investment. The reason the term New Deal is used is it evokes, again, a moment in American history where we were in the Great Depression, and Franklin Roosevelt put forward this program to revive the economy called the New Deal. And the point is that this is supposed to be a way of reviving our economy, taken in a different direction from which it's been working. But in a way, a better metaphor might be wartime mobilization. I think one way of thinking about this is that there's two views about the way the world is going. One of them is there are a lot of people worried about unemployment that will be generated as a result of technological innovation like AI. The chairman of our Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, worried about too much savings. He called it a savings glut. So on the one hand, you have a set of economists who are people who are worried about our having too many resources and not knowing what to do with them. And then when we come to discuss climate change, what do you hear? We can't afford it. Now, those two views can't both be correct. If you have a surplus of resources, it's obvious that we have at least an abundance of resources to use to deal with the green transition. And I think that that dealing with the green transition, the Green New Deal, is an important way of getting out of the quandary that we're in. Well, the other elements of the agenda of what I call progressive capitalism are pretty straightforward, so I'll just go through them very quickly. Public investments in education, science, technology, and infrastructure are at the heart of any successful economy. Government assistance in structural transformation and better systems of social protection, active labor market, industrial policy are particularly important because our society is going through some very dramatic transitions from a manufacturing to a service sector economy, demographic transitions, urbanization transitions, globalization transitions. And I highlighted before the great inequalities, and obviously these have to be dealt with. Progressive taxation is necessary to finance these, and the issue of what is the appropriate structure of taxation has been very much in the political center of discussion, with Elizabeth Warren proposing a wealth tax, which was a tax that was of some controversy in France, but 70% of Americans support her idea of a wealth tax. There are some basic principles of good taxation, like taxing bad things, pollution, excessive financial transactions, actually improve the functioning of economy. Taxing rents are a non-distortionary way of raising revenue. I referred to the fact that we have a strange system where the very rich pay a lower tax rate than ordinary citizens. And multinational corporations have been able to take advantage of globalization to basically avoid taxation. And finally, even if all these reforms were done, it won't suffice to ensure a middle-class life for many citizens, for most citizens. And so the final idea that I talk about is what I call a 21st century reinvigorated welfare state. That has to go beyond just social protection, helping individuals as they go through life, ensuring opportunity, including the opportunity to work. So let me just conclude by saying that I hope I've explained the failures of neoliberalism. I don't have to explain it. You can just look around and see it. But I've also tried to highlight, say that there is an alternative paradigm. The old economic model has failed for over 4 decades. And there are some, I talked about doubling down, but there's another course that a lot of people say, little tweaks, little changes, a little bit more spending on education. I think that's great. But those little tweaks, those little changes are not going to suffice to make our system work. I think it requires major changes based on what we have learned from successes and failures all around the world. What you call it, whether you call it progressive capitalism or a reinvigorated social democracy, is not important. What is important is what we do. And at the core of this is what I described as a new social contract, a new economic order, based on a new relationship between the market, the state, and civil society. And I believe very strongly that this new social contract can produce better growth with more equality and address the climate inequality crisis that we are confronting. Thank you.